What if I told you that one off-the-cuff comment, delivered in just a few seconds, quietly exposed one of the deepest cracks inside the Republican Party right now? Not because of a scandal, not because of a vote, not because of a leaked memo, but because, for the first time in a long while, even Donald Trump's most loyal institutional defender couldn't pretend anymore. This didn't happen behind closed doors. It didn't happen in a whisper campaign. It happened live, in front of cameras, when Donald Trump confidently announced a plan that does not legally exist. And instead of defending him the way he always does, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson froze. He hesitated. He hedged. He warned. And that hesitation sent a signal so loud it couldn't be ignored. Because when the man whose job depends on shielding Trump from consequences starts talking about unintended effects, you know something fundamental has shifted. This isn't about credit cards. It's about power. It's about panic. And it's about what happens when political instinct finally collides with economic reality. Stay with me, because once you see what was said, what wasn't said, and why that pause matters more than any headline, you'll understand why this moment may mark the beginning of a fracture no amount of slogans can hide. It starts the way so many Trump moments do. Quietly, deceptively, almost casually, a press gaggle, a confident tone, a promise that sounds just plausible enough to be believable. Donald Trump announces that he is imposing a hard cap on credit card interest rates, 10%, and that companies who don't comply will face very severe consequences. He speaks as if the law already exists, as if Congress already acted, as if executive power works by declaration alone. And for a brief moment, you can feel the confusion ripple through the room, because there is no such law, there is no executive authority to do this unilaterally, there is no enforcement mechanism, but Trump says it anyway. He frames the Federal Reserve as incompetent. He frames banks as abusers. He frames himself as the lone protector of working Americans. And here's the thing, and the anger he's tapping into is real. Credit card interest rates are brutal. Families are drowning in debt. People don't realize they're paying close to 30% interest. That pain is legitimate. But the question isn't whether the problem exists. The question is why Donald Trump, a man whose political career has been defined by proximity to Wall Street money, billionaire donors, and corporate lobbying, is suddenly pretending to be a consumer protection crusader. And that's where the story takes a turn. Because instead of Democrats being the first to call this out, the resistance comes from inside Trump's own party, specifically from Mike Johnson, a man whose survival strategy has always been obedience through silence. A man whose leadership style is best described as careful invisibility. A man who has spent his tenure avoiding even the appearance of disagreement with Trump. And yet, when asked directly about the 10% cap, Johnson doesn't echo Trump. He doesn't nod, he doesn't praise, he doesn't defend, he explains process, he talks about legislation, he talks about consensus, he talks about unintended consequences, and in Washington, that language is code. What Johnson is really saying, as politely as possible, is that the president has not thought this through. There is no plan, there is no legal pathway, there is no appetite in Congress to make this real. And that moment matters more than almost anything else that's happened recently, because it exposes a widening gap inside the Republican Party between Trump's improvisational politics and institutional panic. Trump governs by announcement, leadership governs by containment. Trump throws out bold ideas. Leadership worries about donors, markets, and backlash. And this is the first time that gap becomes visible on camera. Johnson tries to walk a tightrope. He praises Trump's intent, lowering costs, but he distances himself from execution. He warns that banks could stop lending. He cautions against negative secondary effects. That's not rebellion, but it is doubt expressed out loud. And for a movement built on absolute loyalty, doubt is dangerous. Because once someone like Mike Johnson signals limits, everyone else notices. This moment lands especially hard because of the context surrounding it. Just days earlier, Trump was attacking the Federal Reserve, personalizing inflation, blaming Jerome Powell while defending tariffs that economists across the spectrum agree raise prices for consumers. Now he's floating a populist-sounding fix that bypasses Congress entirely. That contradiction is impossible to miss. Trump wants to blame institutions while pretending to regulate markets. without actually regulating them. He wants a villain that isn't himself. He wants a headline that sounds populist. He wants applause without follow-through. And Republican leadership knows exactly what that is: performance. But this performance crosses a line that makes donors nervous. Rhetorically attacking banks, even without policy, sets off alarm bells for a party structurally dependent on financial sector money. And that's why Johnson's discomfort is so revealing. For all the chaos Trump has unleashed, foreign policy whiplash, constitutional stress tests, erosion of norms, this is the moment that triggers visible unease. Not democracy, not institutions, but profit margins. That contrast tells you everything you need to know about the hierarchy of concern inside Republican leadership. And Democrats are already exploiting it. Elizabeth Warren points out the obvious contradiction. If Trump cared about consumer protection, he wouldn't be dismantling regulatory agencies. He wouldn't be undermining oversight. He wouldn't be offering imaginary enforcement. And the more this contradiction is discussed, the harder it becomes for Republicans to defend Trump without sounding unserious. That's why Johnson hedges instead of applauds, because applause would require commitment. And commitment would require legislation. And legislation would require angering donors. So instead, Johnson does what leaders do when they're trapped. He praises the goal, questions the method, and warns about consequences. And in doing so, he inadvertently confirms the central critique of Trump's presidency: impulse over governance, spectacle over structure. As Trump takes this message on the road, selling it as part of a broader economic pitch, the tension only grows, because voters are no longer responding to slogans. They're responding to lived experience: rising rent, rising grocery prices, rising debt. And when rhetoric collapses under scrutiny, hesitation becomes visible. By the midpoint of this story, it's no longer about credit cards. It's about a party that governs by avoidance, a president who governs by declaration, and a speaker who, for the first time, lets slip that even he can't pretend every idea is genius anymore. And that is where this truly begins. What makes Mike Johnson's hesitation so consequential is not what he said, but what he couldn't say. He could not say, yes, the president can do this. He could not say, Congress is ready to act. He could not say, this is real policy. Instead, he did something far more revealing. He translated Trump's declaration back into reality, and that translation stripped the illusion away. In Washington, there is a massive difference between an idea and a plan. Trump operates almost exclusively in the former. Congress is forced to live in the latter. And for years, Republican leadership has tried to bridge that gap by pretending Trump's instincts were policy in disguise. That strategy is failing, because the stakes are no longer abstract. The economy is no longer theoretical. Inflation is no longer a talking point. Debt is no longer hidden. People feel it every time they swipe a card, fill a tank, or open a bill. That's why Trump's announcement hit such a nerve. On the surface, it sounded populist, almost left-coded. A cap on credit card interest rates sounds like something voters want because they do want it. But underneath that surface is a contradiction so sharp it forces even loyalists to flinch. Donald Trump is not an anti-bank president. He is not an anti-Wall Street president. He has never governed as one. His administration was defined by deregulation, by rolling back consumer protections, by appointing industry insiders to oversee the very sectors they once lobbied for. So when he suddenly presents himself as the defender of borrowers against lenders, the question becomes unavoidable. Is this policy or is this panic? Mike Johnson's reaction suggests Republicans know the answer, because Johnson didn't attack the idea outright. He did something smarter. He reframed it as hypothetical. He talked about looking into it. He talked about studying it. He talked about experts. That's Washington's way of saying, this is not happening. And that matters because it reveals the new dynamic inside the GOP. Trump still controls the microphone, but he no longer controls the machinery, and that gap is widening. For years, Trump's style worked because conditions allowed it to. Low inflation masked policy incoherence. Markets absorbed chaos. Voters were divided on what mattered most. But now, the economy has become the dominant issue, and economic policy does not tolerate improvisation. Markets do not respond to vibes. Banks do not respond to speeches. Institutions do not move because someone sounds confident. They move because laws change. And Johnson knows that. That's why he brings up unintended consequences. That phrase is not accidental. It's a warning. What he's saying is, if you actually did this, credit would tighten, lending would dry up, risk would shift, and the people Trump claims to be helping could be hurt instead. That doesn't mean Johnson cares deeply about borrowers. It means he understands second-order effects, and Trump doesn't. This is the core tension now ripping through the Republican Party. Trump's politics are emotional and immediate. Leadership's fears are structural and long-term. Trump wants applause today, leadership wants survival tomorrow, and the pressure is coming from everywhere. Donors are nervous, markets are volatile. Polls show cost of living anxiety dominating voter concerns. And Republicans know that if they walk into the next election cycle with no serious economic plan, cultural messaging won't save them. That's why Johnson's pause mattered. It wasn't defiance, it was damage control. Because if Johnson had enthusiastically endorsed the idea, he would have owned it. And once Congress owns an idea, donors demand answers. Lobbyists demand carve-outs. Financial institutions demand reassurance. Johnson wasn't prepared to open that door, so instead he subtly shut it. This is the beginning of a new phase in Trump world. Containment, not resistance, not rebellion. Containment. Leadership trying to slow Trump down without confronting him directly. Trying to translate his declarations into something manageable. Trying to keep the wheels from coming off while pretending everything is fine. But containment has limits because Trump doesn't slow down. He escalates. When he senses hesitation, he doubles down. When he senses doubt, he attacks. And that's what makes this moment dangerous for Republicans, because once hesitation becomes visible, Trump's instinct is not to adjust, it's to punish. But punishing Mike Johnson would expose the problem even further. Johnson is not some backbencher. He's the Speaker of the House. And the fact that even he is choosing his words carefully tells you how much stress is building behind the scenes. This isn't the first time Johnson has had to do this recently. He's also had to quietly distance himself from Trump's more extreme foreign policy musings, from offhand remarks about territorial expansion, from hypothetical actions that would cause immediate international fallout. Each time, Johnson responds the same way, disbelief wrapped in denial. He reassures the public that no serious person is considering these things. But Trump is a serious person in this context. He's the president, and that contradiction is becoming impossible to hide. What Johnson is really trying to say, without ever saying it, is that Trump's words no longer automatically translate into action. That used to be Trump's greatest strength. Now it's becoming his greatest weakness, because once voters realize that many of Trump's promises are not real, not enforceable, not planned, not supported, the spectacle loses its power. People don't just want anger, they want results. And this is where Democrats sense an opening. They're not attacking the idea of lowering interest rates. They're attacking the emptiness of Trump's execution. Elizabeth Warren doesn't dismiss the concept. She points out Trump's failure to act. She notes that he's had years to push real consumer protection and chose not to. She highlights that housing supply bills are stalled, that regulatory agencies are undermined, that rhetoric replaces legislation. That's a smart strategy, because it reframes the debate away from ideology and toward competence. And competence is where Trump struggles the most. Trump wants to talk about villains. Democrats want to talk about mechanisms. Trump wants to say, I'll fix it. Democrats want to ask how. And when Republicans like Mike Johnson start echoing the how question, even cautiously, the entire dynamic shifts, because now it's not Democrats versus Trump, it's reality versus performance. And that's a fight Trump has always lost eventually. The economy doesn't care who you blame. Debt doesn't care who you insult. Interest doesn't fall because someone says it should. Johnson knows this. That's why he emphasized process. That's why he warned about consequences. That's why he didn't clap. And in politics, what you don't do is often more important than what you do. Johnson's hesitation didn't stop Trump, but it did something just as important. It showed the audience at home that even Trump's defenders know the limits now, that there are boundaries he can't simply talk his way past, that governing requires more than confidence. And once that realization sets in, it doesn't go away. What makes this moment linger is not the policy debate, not the back and forth over credit cards, and not even Mike Johnson's careful phrasing. What makes it linger is the psychological shift it reveals, a shift that voters feel long before politicians admit it. Because this wasn't a rebellion, it was something more destabilizing. It was hesitation, and hesitation inside a movement built on certainty is corrosive. For nearly a decade, Trumpism has relied on a single governing principle: confidence equals competence. If Trump says it forcefully enough, it must be true. If he announces it publicly, it must be happening. If he declares victory, the details don't matter. That formula worked when consequences felt distant. It does not work when people are opening credit card bills, paying rent, and watching their savings disappear. And this is where the economic pressure changes everything. Voters may tolerate chaos when it feels abstract. They stop tolerating it when it costs them money. That's why Trump's improvisational style is colliding head-on with reality right now, because economic policy is unforgiving. You can't declare interest rates lower. You can't threaten inflation away. You can't intimidate markets into compliance. And the people who understand that best are not activists or pundits. They are institutional leaders like Mike Johnson, whose job is to prevent panic, reassure donors, and keep the system from unraveling. That's why Johnson's words were so careful. He wasn't trying to embarrass Trump. He wasn't trying to oppose him. He was trying to contain damage, and containment is a sign of fear. Fear that Trump's words are creating expectations Congress cannot meet. Fear that donors will panic. Fear that markets will react. Fear that voters will notice the gap between promise and reality. This is not the language of confidence. It's the language of triage. And the most telling part is that Johnson didn't deny the policy because denying it would require confrontation. Instead, he buried it under process, study, consensus, secondary effects, complexity. That's how Washington kills ideas without saying no, and viewers saw it. You could hear it in the silence after his answers. You could feel it in the awkward framing. You could see it in how carefully he avoided committing to anything concrete. That moment pierced the illusion. Because Trump's brand depends on the idea that when he speaks, the party moves. When he announces, institutions follow. When he decides, things happen. Johnson's hesitation said something else entirely. Not this time. And that sends shockwaves far beyond one press conference. It tells donors that Congress is not on board. It tells banks that this is rhetoric, not regulation. It tells voters that promises may dissolve on contact with reality. And once voters start internalizing that, Trump's greatest strength, his perceived decisiveness, becomes a liability. Because decisiveness without delivery looks like recklessness. And recklessness is not what people want when they're worried about their finances. This is why the Republican Party feels so tense right now. They are caught between a leader who thrives on performance and an electorate that is demanding preparation. Cultural outrage can dominate headlines, but it cannot lower interest rates. Blame can energize a base, but it cannot stabilize prices. Confidence can win applause, but it cannot substitute for policy. Mike Johnson knows this. That's why his instinct was not to cheer, but to caution. And that caution is spreading. You can see it in how Republican leaders talk about tariffs now. Less bravado, more defensiveness. You can see it in how they talk about the Federal Reserve, careful not to fully endorse attacks. You can see it in how they talk about economic pain, vague concern without clear solutions. This is what a party looks like when it knows it has a problem, but doesn't know how to fix it. They can't confront Trump directly without risking backlash. They can't fully embrace his ideas without risking disaster, so they hedge. And hedging is not leadership. That's why this episode resonates beyond its immediate context. It reveals a party governed by avoidance, a presidency governed by impulse, and an economy that doesn't care about either. As Trump continues to campaign on bold declarations, the friction will only increase. Because every new promise creates another moment where someone like Mike Johnson has to translate fantasy into feasibility. And every time that happens, the illusion weakens. Voters are not stupid. They understand when something doesn't add up. They understand when leaders speak in circles. They understand when applause replaces action. And they are tired of being told help is coming without seeing it. tired of being blamed for systems they didn't design, tired of watching politicians perform certainty while living with uncertainty. This is why economic credibility matters more now than ever. And this is why moments like Johnson's hesitation carry so much weight, because they show that even inside the most disciplined political movements, reality eventually asserts itself. Not loudly, not dramatically, but through pauses, through qualifiers, through carefully chosen words. That's how power shifts in Washington, not through explosions, but through erosion. Trump continues to operate in a world where saying something forcefully is treated as proof of inevitability. But the world voters live in doesn't work that way. Bills don't shrink because of speeches. Interest doesn't fall because of anger. Debt doesn't disappear because of declarations. And the more that gap becomes visible, the harder it becomes to sustain the performance. Mike Johnson didn't rebel, but he revealed something far more damaging to a movement built on unquestioned loyalty. He revealed doubt, and once doubt enters the public record, it doesn't vanish. It lingers. It spreads. It invites questions. If this idea isn't real, what else isn't? If this promise can't happen, which ones can? If leaders know something won't work but still applaud it in principle, who is this really for? Those questions don't need answers immediately to be powerful. They just need to be asked. And now they are. This wasn't just an awkward exchange. It wasn't just a policy disagreement. It was a signal that even Trump's most careful defenders are starting to choose their words differently, a signal that confidence alone is no longer enough, and a signal that the cracks inside the Republican Party are no longer coming from the outside. They're forming quietly inside the walls, not through shouting, but through hesitation. And in politics, that's often how the biggest shifts begin.